So I'm Adam Hugg. I'm director of the Foreign Policy Centre. We are hosting today's event with the Aston Centre for Europe as part of a collaboration that we've had for a number of years, normally in Parliament, but today we are going out live on Facebook Live and on Zoom to discuss some of the issues relating to the Commonwealth Games, asking the question, can the 2022 Birmingham Commonwealth Games help the UK's post-Brexit sport diplomacy get out of the starting blocks? So we're looking at the role that Birmingham can play, Britain coming out of the pandemic and setting itself post-integrated review on the international stage, looking at the way in which sporting events like this can be an important part of the UK's soft power. So that fits very much in line with some of the findings we had in our project on finding Britain's role in the world, which looked a lot at the importance of UK soft power to our diplomacy. We're delighted to be joined here by a great panel of speakers. Slight change to the lineup at the last moment. We have Dr. Daniel Fitzpatrick, who's lecturer at the Aston Centre for Europe. We have Neil Coleman, who was senior advisor on London 2012 to both mayors, Ken Livingstone and Boris Johnson, and is now undertaking a number of roles in relation to Birmingham 2022. Delighted to be joined by Baroness Gray Thompson, who is obviously storied Paralympian and a crossbench peer in the House of Lords. Sunda Katwala, who is Director of British Future. And we're joined by Chris Matheson MP, who's the Shadow Minister for Media, who is a substitute, if that's ever used as a sporting reference, for Ali McGovern, who unfortunately had to drop out due to a last-minute issue. But delighted to have you all here, and delighted to hand over to Danny to get things underway. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Adam. It's fantastic to be able to contribute to this discussion on the Commonwealth Games next year in Birmingham, obviously working at Aston University and reflecting on what they might mean for the nature of the UK sport diplomacy going forward in the future. I think both sports diplomacy and the Commonwealth Games as an event, they've both been kind of neglected really as a subject of political and academic discussion in the past. So events such as these are welcome, and special thanks to Poppy and Adam at the Foreign Policy Centre for pulling this event together. I'd like to start by kind of problematising the question a little bit and offering something of a paradox instead. I think for while the Games will be the biggest sport event since the UK left the EU last year, I don't think it's probably entirely accurate to kind of label them post kind of Brexit per se, in the sense that next year we'll be kind of still living with some of the and grappling with some of the divisions and debates that have afflicted British political discourse since 2016, not least the future of the union itself. So I think that's important to bear in mind. And I suppose as a result, it's unrealistic always in this context to expect sport to offer a clear way forward. We can only respond to the political and policy context it finds itself in. However, in another sense, the Commonwealth Games, I think, are kind of contradictory and paradoxically truly a post-Brexit event. And what I mean by that is often the prevailing political context and climate of a sports mega event is coincidental, in the sense that it could not really be foreseen at the outset of what is a long bidding process. So, for example, if we think about London 2012, post-global financial crisis, in the midst of austerity, that was not foreseen at the beginning of that bidding process. But that's not the case, actually, with Birmingham 2022, and that's quite unusual. For those who are unaware, the bidding process was quite a protracted affair. So originally the Games were meant to be held in Durban, South Africa. So Durban was awarded the Games in 2015 after the only other bidder, Edmonton, withdrew. In March 2017, however, the Commonwealth Games Federation withdrew the invitation to host because of the lack of financial guarantees by the South African government. Birmingham subsequently beat Liverpool to be the kind of candidate city for England, and then Birmingham itself was awarded it by default when no other viable bids emerged. So kind of an unusual and quite protracted affair. As an aside, it's actually the second time an English city's been awarded or replaced rather the South African host of the Commonwealth Games after London replaced Johannesburg in 1934, the second iteration of the Commonwealth Games. After a number of countries expressed concerns about the treatment of Black and Asian athletes in then apartheid South Africa, obviously. So Birmingham did not initially bid for the games and stepped in at a later date, supported by the UK government. So obviously seeing a particular opportunity in the context of Brexit. And right from the outset, the games were framed as a post-Brexit event to market Birmingham, West Midlands and the UK to the world in this new era. Andy Street, the West Midlands mayor, he made an explicit appeal in 2017 for the games as an opportunity to show the world, and I'm quoting here, post-Brexit, that Britain is open for business. So those ideas of global Britain were kind of inserted into the sport diplomacy of the games from the word go. And there was also an explicit appeal made to the reaffirming the trade and cultural links with the Commonwealth, drawing on the diaspora communities in the region. So the way I see it from my perspective, there's an obvious opportunity or a trap, depending on your perspective, to use the games to strengthen the diplomatic links, firstly with the Commonwealth, but also within that, the kind of the Anglosphere, particularly Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and India in particular. And while the games does undoubtedly provide a diplomatic platform for this, my reading of it and my analysis of it, I think there's a real risk of what is sometimes called soft disempowerment. So the opposite of soft power. Why is that? Well, given the kind of clear post-imperial ties of the Commonwealth Games, I think there's a potential dissonance between the marketing of Birmingham as a city of the Commonwealth, you know, drawing on its kind of status as a super diverse city, coupled with and alongside a more strategic appeal to what Churchill called the English-speaking peoples, as well as domestic policies that could be seen as relatively anti-democratic or anti-immigrant. All those things together cannot work as a sports, a strategy of sports diplomacy. And I think that's something that really we need to be kind of aware of and kind of cognizant of, kind of when thinking about the games and what they can do, given these different moving parts. However, my view ultimately is that much of the sport diplomacy around global Britain, the Commonwealth and the Anglosphere will be displaced by the pandemic and the post-pandemic, let's hope it's euphoria. And I think that will become the real story of the games. So Birmingham 2022, I think will become to be seen as the first major post-COVID event globally, which will give it a real kind of platform and prestige, I think, more so than a typical Commonwealth Games. Obviously, the pandemic has much greater resonance across the world than Brexit. So when we're thinking about what the games mean post-Brexit, really, it's probably post-COVID. Because obviously the Euros and the Olympics are happening this year, but they've already been moved and rescheduled, and they will continue to be affected by the restrictions. And I think there's real kind of soft power potential here for Birmingham and England and the UK, because given the challenges faced by the organising committee, the City Council and the West Midlands Combined Authority in delivering this event, given they had around about 3 years less time than would be typical due to the move from Durban to Birmingham. And to put that into context, Glasgow, I think, started planning for the 2014 Commonwealth Games, I think in 2001, 2002. The uncertainty around Brexit and also COVID, I think just delivering the event will be a huge boon to the city and the region's soft power and prestige. I'll finish. I think there's two further opportunities for sport diplomacy over and above just the kind of delivery of a successful games. I think the first one is to forge a kind of less gendered and less masculinized portrayal of sport and nationalism in England. I think there's a real opportunity to shift the narrative, particularly on English sport and nationalism. And it's obviously important to note that in the Commonwealth Games, the constituent nations of the UK are competing separately. And I note that the Commonwealth Games Federation has highlighted the fact that there are more women's medal events than men's in 2022 for the first time ever. So I think emphasising that developing female athletes more as symbols of England should be a crucial plank of UK sports diplomacy. And next year, with the Games and also with the Women's World Cup in Australia and New Zealand, I think there's a massive opportunity to do that. And the other key tie-in, which is maybe a little bit more obvious, is the centenary celebrations of the BBC, which is being confirmed as the official broadcaster of the Games. So arguably the BBC as the kind of the key asset of UK's cultural diplomacy. I think that is inherently linked to, and its status, its continued status as a sport broadcaster is inherently linked not only to UK's cultural diplomacy, but also the UK as a major sporting nation. So I'll finish there and pass back to Adam. I'm looking forward to the contributions of the other speakers.
Thanks, Danny. Really good to set us off with the sort of conceptual overview of that. Like to turn now to Neil Coleman, who has experience obviously delivering on some of these sort of bigger picture things as through 2012, and obviously now trying to do again for 2022. Neil, you're on mute, Neil.
That's a good start, isn't it? Thanks very much, Adam, and thanks, Danny, for an interesting and challenging start to the conversation. Now, it was actually 16 years and 12 days ago. I was fortunate enough to be in Singapore at the, I think Tanny was there as well, on the occasion of the International Olympic Committee's decision of who was going to be the host city for the 2012 Olympic and Paralympic Games. And in the morning, we went into a large hall in Singapore and did the London presentation, or rather a selection of people, but including Seb Coe, I'm picking out the men, but there were Seb Coe, Tony Blair and Ken Livingstone did the presentation for the Games. And Seb started his speech there by saying, and I'm quoting from him, "London's vision is to reach people all around the world, to connect them with the inspirational power of the Games. Choose London today and you send a clear message to the youth of the world. More than ever, the Olympic Games are for you." And London and the London brand for the 2012 Games was all around the power of the Games to inspire lasting change. And so right up front from the start of the London 2012 presentation were, I suppose, the soft power objectives were about attracting young people around the world and projecting London's image as a place of young people, as a place that was diverse, and as a place that was promising a new legacy for the Games. We had two videos that were shown in that presentation, and one was they were both beautifully crafted pieces of work, and one was showing 4 young people from Mexico, Africa, Russia and China, and how those young people through their lives were inspired by looking at the Games, by knowing about the Olympics, to become great athletes themselves. And then there was a stunning video about London, which remarkably, I remember it had Ken Livingstone in tears the first time he saw it. It was a really brilliant piece of work. And one of the things that the London 2012 team brilliantly also pulled off that day was a message from Nelson Mandela, as part of the London bid, saying there was no better place than London to unite the world. And the amazing contrast between the London presentation and the very dry and an insipid Paris presentation that day was further put into focus by the London delegation to the Games, which had 30 school students from the potential host borough of Newham, an amazing bunch of young people from all over the world who sat in and watched that presentation, and again provided this astonishing contrast to Paris. And I spoke, and Tani may have had the same experience, to a number of IOC delegates after the vote, and remarkably, there were IOC delegates who I think genuinely changed their vote to London on the strength of this presentation and on the pitch around legacy, young people, and so on. So it was a remarkable day. You know, it was all around young people. It was around sport participation. And I suppose in retrospect, when you think about it, and again, Tani may disagree with this, although we made much of inspiring young people to choose sport, if you look at what we actually did in the UK around sport participation, which we talked a lot about, it wasn't a very great story. There were successes, but I don't think we really tried as a nation to emulate, say, the successes of some of the Nordic countries around sports participation, because that would have required spending rather a lot of money. We did talk about putting on a school games, and we did put on a school games, but that hasn't lasted. And so there is always an interesting difference between the messaging and the reality. And what I think we can say actually was that in soft power terms, one of the things that we did do during London 2012, which the British Council led on, an organisation that is rather good at doing this sort of thing, we did do a remarkable programme called International Inspiration, which actually reached out to 21 countries across the world, worked with literally millions of young people around sport, around improving training, improving policy, I think 250,000 practitioners. And actually what we did there, I think, was a lot better than what we did in the UK around sports participation. But one of the things that the Mandela message, I think, speaks to is that London started with a huge advantage, given its established brand, given what London represented and still represents to some extent to people across the world. And that isn't an advantage which Birmingham starts from. And one of the critical things that Birmingham has said it wants to do, and the West Midlands has said they want to do for this programme, one of the objectives is to put us on the global stage. And I think that's going to be challenging. I mean, one of the things I'd say is that although this pitch, the soft power stuff, was obviously important, when we were running and managing the games and looking at delivery, we were always much more bothered about what people in the UK thought about it. We were always on the defensive about the cost of the games, about delivery of the games, and we spent far more time, and I'm sure this is actually going to be the case with the Commonwealth Games as well, bothering about what messages and comms we were sending to people in the UK than we did about what we were doing overseas. And equally, that tension is not dissimilar perhaps to the tension between what you do for legacy and what you do for actually delivering the games. I think we did a pretty good job on a number of aspects of legacy. I think particularly on the regeneration of East London, which I think is a phenomenal story. And if you go to Stratford and the Olympic Park today, it just blows you away how that whole area has changed. And there were other areas we did well on as well, I think. But if push comes to shove, when you're running one of these big events and you have a choice between legacy and the games and delivery, you always need to choose delivery and the games, because if you don't, you won't have a legacy. And the first challenge, and it's been referred to in the initial contribution, that Birmingham faces is to deliver an amazing event. And if they don't do that, you know, you can forget soft power, and indeed you can forget having a success for the city and for the region. And I was struck just looking back over Delhi today and looking at the Guardian headline, which read, "Critics call Commonwealth Games crisis symptom of a failed state," and recorded the Times of India poll, which showed that 97% of those questions thought that the Commonwealth Games in Delhi had tarnished India's image. And so the challenges that Birmingham faces, and they are substantial, doing it 4 years early is a real challenge. And doing that with COVID, I think that everyone in Birmingham, from my knowledge, has been doing an amazing job, actually. But it isn't easy. In London, we got all the venues finished 6-9 months before the games, plenty of time to test them. Because they're doing it 4 years early, they're going to get the venues ready 2-3 months before the games. It's going to be very challenging, and it's really critical that the games are seen as a success, in that if anything puts Birmingham and the Midlands on the world stage, it will be delivering a fantastic and successful event in full stadia, despite all the challenges that they've faced. And I think that if you look at what made London, it wasn't so much the talk and the prep, it was actually the event and the thousands of volunteers, supporters and spectators, the atmosphere in the city and in the country, which sort of, I think, overcame a lot of the impression that people had perhaps of the UK as a sporting nation, which was the UK used to present itself as the inventor of all these sports. It was seen as being pretty arrogant, and I think resented for that. And I think the way London came across, and the fans, the volunteers, the success of the games helped to overcome that. I think what Birmingham has done plainly in presenting its vision for the games, and there is quite a detailed legacy plan now online. You can see the strapline, the games for everyone, Birmingham as a Commonwealth city, really many of the same themes as London in terms of diversity. And I do think that the points that were made about, you know, really is that right, or is the pitch really going to be to essentially Canada, Australia, New Zealand, maybe India, and certainly if you look at the quite large tourism and inward investment program, that's going to be hitting those markets. It ain't going to be hitting anywhere else. I think, though, that I mean, I think we will see that Birmingham as a Commonwealth city really powerfully represented in the launch of their volunteering program, which is going to come very soon. And I think making that really successful will, as it did in London, have potentially a huge impact and be seen internationally as well as nationally. But I very much agree with the view already expressed that dominating this event inevitably will be the COVID lens. I don't think one can get away from that. And I think, again, that is being very consciously pitched, and pitched rightly for a whole variety of reasons, but also pitched politically. So, I mean, if you go to the legacy plan that Birmingham has, you'll see the slightly grandiloquent claim that the Games is a significant milestone in the world's road to recovery. And that we will hear a lot of that. And it is being packaged together with a whole series of things that happen next year, particularly the Queen's Platinum Jubilee, the Festival UK that the government is putting on, the centenary of the BBC that's been referred to. I think the 75th anniversary of the Edinburgh Festival will be played in, because it's compulsory now to have a union piece in all this stuff. And then there is the 10th anniversary of London 2012 as well. So I think that will be a big sell here. And again, I'm just going to quote, in drawing to a close, how this is partly being pitched by Birmingham, and this is from their legacy plan, and they say, of course, Birmingham and the West Midlands have been hit hard by the impacts of the pandemic. Many people, particularly the most vulnerable and disadvantaged in society, have suffered hardship. This is shaping a unique Commonwealth Games story and is where the legacy of Birmingham 2022 must begin, helping to shape the recovery and renewal of Birmingham, the West Midlands and the UK as we look to build back better. So some phrases that are familiar from other places there. But I think, just two final points about why that's not entirely straightforward. I think one is the coronavirus that we're suffering from retains its ability to surprise and bother us at every turn, as we've seen in the last 3 or 4 days with the new variant. And it's quite clear that although it is going to be presented as a post-COVID event, but there are going to be significant ways in which this event will still suffer from restriction and special measures. It's the only way to run the event. And how far we will have got to full stadia by then is not certain, but there will need to be a range of precautionary measures. And I think we're going to see shortly in Tokyo some quite difficult scenes and presentations, as you're already seeing in the protests that are taking place in Tokyo and throughout Japan about the holding of the games there. Hopefully we will be well over that, but we have issues already with things that are normally part of these games, like the Queen's Baton Relay, which is the way in which initially messages about the Commonwealth are sent out, and the way that people interact with Commonwealth countries in the run-up to the Games. That's going to be extremely difficult. And clearly there are a load of questions around, political questions around about recovery, COVID, the developing world, the vaccine, vaccine patents and the like. And those issues, I'm sure, may well come into focus as part of the conversation around this. So I don't think it's straightforward, but I do think that's where the focus is going to be, and that's where that's where the politics around this are going to be. So I should probably shut up. I've said enough.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Neil. I mean, and I think that's something we can get to in the Q&A section at the end. Is frankly, if the global vaccine response hasn't got to a place where people from large chunks of the Commonwealth won't be able to attend because the ongoing COVID situation, and that is obviously a very stark contrast that the UK wouldn't want to be drawing in practice. But I think we discussed those in the Q&A at the end. And just to say, if people want to put questions in the Q&A box, we'll be addressing them once the initial speakers have finished their comments. Fantastic. Delighted to bring in Baroness Gray-Thompson. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Can I apologise for my background? I've come back to work in Westminster, and the only place with decent Wi-Fi in the building is not my office, but it's the kitchen. So apologies for that. I'm going to read out what is probably a long list of declaration of interests in terms of how I come to be part of this debate. So I've competed at 3 Commonwealth Games, 1 exhibition status where we weren't allowed to stay in the village or have medals or actually even kit. Myself and fellow male Welsh athlete Chris Hallam had to share 1 Welsh vest between us. I competed at 2 Commonwealth Games as full medal status. I worked at 1 Games because there weren't any women's events. And somebody from the team rang me up and started off saying, "My dear, I don't mean to be patronising." So whenever anyone starts that conversation, you know they are. And they told me, being a woman and a wheelchair user, I couldn't possibly be a team administrator. So anyway, that letter got caught in my fax machine. Shows how long ago it was. But I've also competed at 5 Paralympics, demonstration races at 4 Olympics. So I've seen the good, the bad, and the indifferent of bids, organisations, and also the legacy, and some of the promises that different games have made. about legacy. Now, I do find it really strange that we talk about there being no politics in sport. There's so much politics in sport. I mean, actually, my transferring from sport to politics was actually incredibly easy because I grew up in sport. So I think we have to, address some of the issues about what we mean by that, and also when we talk about soft politics, because the medal table of any games is very political. Even though the IOC for Olympics will say that, that the medal table is not something they encourage, it's something that actually that's the reason that we all compete there. But I think it's really important to recognise that competing at Commonwealth is quite different to competing for Great Britain, and depending which home country you compete for is quite different. So me being Welsh, there can be a very different view from English athletes about competing at the Games to Scottish, Northern Irish and Welsh. So I do worry sometimes that the view of the Games is very England-centric, and that can be helpful, but also I think it can provide some challenges. Because in the transference from the Empire Games to the Commonwealth Games and each iteration of it, I think we have to be mindful that the world is moving on. And Neil mentioned a couple of things about international inspiration. I was part of that and went to a couple of visits, Palestine and Egypt. One of the things that was really good about that was international inspiration didn't tell countries how they should do legacy or sports development. It was about supporting them with the British Council and about learning, and that information went both ways. So I think sometimes we just have to be careful that just because we invented it and we were good at it for a while and we're quite good at a lot of sports again, that doesn't mean to say that we, have every single answer to what the games can be. So I was part of the Manchester bid for the 2000 Games, and one of my jobs was going around telling lots of athletes, if a journalist asks you, you have to say you want to compete in Manchester, not Sydney. And the reality is that as a young athlete, you do want to travel. But also the reality is that if we'd won the Games in 2000, we wouldn't have been ready as a country on so many levels. We needed Barbara Cassani to come in and start the bid for London, and then Seb to come in after. And we needed time for lottery funding to really bed in terms of performance. I think some of the challenges of that is that it developed a set of behaviours in some sports that weren't very positive, and then being the country that wants to bounce back to Rio just embeds a set of behaviours which aren't always terribly healthy for long-term development of athletes, and especially as they transition out of sport. But I think there's a lot to learn from London, not least when Neil mentioned the 30 young people that went into the room, and it was a really powerful moment. And actually one of the French IOC members said to me as we came out, we got emotion from the bid that they never expected. But the politics of taking 30 young people to get 30 of the great and the good who thought they had a right to sit in that part of the process was an amazing piece of work to win. But the reality is the legacy is not going to come without a huge amount of investment. And, winning and building and lots of conversations about budget, legacy is something that very quickly sort of gets pushed back. And I do think Seb Coe and the team were right to say our job is to deliver the Games. It's not to do anything else. But legacy doesn't come without a massive amount of cost. And, the 10 billion or whatever that London cost, that's in my bank account, that would be a lot of money. But in terms of actually, I think, what it's done for us as a country, it did inspire young people to do things. It didn't change the world. I guess one of my frustrations is that a lot of people will say 2012 changed the world for disabled people. Well, it didn't. Disability hate crime against disabled children's doubled. Do not attempt resuscitation orders were put on tens of thousands of disabled people at the start of the pandemic with no underlying health conditions. 2012 didn't change that. But the Games were incredible and stunning and amazing. Definitely sport and the Games has the potential to shift the dialogue and start a different conversation and do things in a different way. And Nelson Mandela said sport has the power to change the world. I do believe that, but I don't think you can expect a single Games to do it. I think some of the things that I think are really interesting that we sort of forget about with London is that the South Bank, the cobbles got removed as part of the Games, which never would have happened, which is amazing for wheelchair users like me. The tube network, there was investment into Green Park and King's Cross, 80 and 120 million each to allow it to be step-free access. That wouldn't have happened without the Games. And the regeneration. So I sit on the board of Olympic Park LLDC. You just need to go and see the things that are happening out there, the regeneration. And actually the IOC are now looking to London to learn from it. So I think there are things we can, although the size and scale of Olympics and Commonwealths is different, we can learn. And one of the things I'm really excited about with the Commonwealth Games is the inclusion of disabled athletes. It's built year on year. The Games in Birmingham will have more disabled participants competing across a bigger range of sports, which is fantastic. There are some difficult questions we need to ask about who are the athletes and from what countries are winning medals. Because actually in some sports, like my sport, wheelchair racing, it's amazing it's there, but a racing chair can cost between £5,000 and £18,000. That is not affordable for actually a lot of people in Britain, let alone in other developing countries. So, you know, I think we need to think about that and think about some sports development. I've just joined the Commonwealth Sports Foundation, which is a new charity, which is linked to the Commonwealth Games, which is looking about how we can develop projects and funding and help sport, again, not going in and telling countries or projects what to do, but to raise the level. So there's some really exciting things, but, you know, in terms of what we can do in education, what we can do with the tram network in Birmingham, you know, what we can do about volunteering, how we can inspire young people to do things in a different way, even if it doesn't inspire them to be an elite athlete. But we don't have a lot of time to do it. And for me, one of the things that I would like to see, you know, something like the schools programme needs, you know, to be really stepped up, to actually build up the momentum for the games. We don't know whether we're going to be able to have spectators or, you know, what that world is going to look like. But what I would say is we can't throw away the opportunity to do something differently because we've got the games. It might come to one of the other home countries in a few sort of cycles' time. But this is an amazing opportunity to do things differently. We have to do everything we can to make sure it happens. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Danny. That's brilliant. Delighted to hand over now to Sunda to say a few words.
Thanks, Adam. Thanks for the invitation. It's nice to be back, if virtually, with the Foreign Policy Centre. I was in the startup team of the Foreign Policy Centre. This is 1999, so taking you back away. And the two themes I wrote about for the Foreign Policy Centre were making the Commonwealth matter and reinventing the Commonwealth, which we took to the South African CHOGM of 1999, and democratising global sport, which was about the governance of sport. There were a lot of scandals and misgovernance going on in sport, as I'm sure all of that's changed completely these days. And so the two themes there of sport and the Commonwealth perhaps make me a useful returnee for this event. I think the Commonwealth Games are going to be good for Birmingham especially, and Britain in the world and the Commonwealth. And one of the ways they're going to be good for Britain after Brexit is they won't be about Brexit. And I think that will be important to their success in Birmingham, in Britain, and internationally as well. And so I think the Brexit frame is not very helpful for some of the reasons the others have said. And, you know, we're thinking about COVID anyway, but most people aren't going to be thinking about Brexit when they think about the Commonwealth Games in Birmingham. I mean, if we look at the Brexit vote in Birmingham, it was the 50-50 city in our country, and so the 450,000 votes. I mean, Leave won it by 3,000 and a bit, but Birmingham split absolutely down the middle on this question. I don't think anybody who gets a ticket to any of the events will be looking at other people in the stadium and saying, will you remain or will you leave? So it's something we do together. It's something Birmingham does. It's something that puts Birmingham at the centre of the national conversation, at the centre of an international conversation. It's its moment in the spotlight, and it's going to be a moment of pride for Birmingham, in the same way it was for Glasgow, in the same way it was for Manchester, to have the world in Birmingham in this way. And I think that will make a contribution, I think, to Britain, you know, moving beyond the political arguments we had about Brexit, being in the world and proud to be in the world, being proud to be internationalist and to celebrate the values of the Commonwealth, but not in a way that says, are you in favour of engagement with the Commonwealth, or are you in favour of engagement with the continent of Europe? I think it will transcend that in a way that will be good for the Games. I think Birmingham's story about why Birmingham is hosting the Commonwealth and hosting the world is the story of why Birmingham is Birmingham. I think the story of Birmingham and the Commonwealth are inextricably linked. The Commonwealth has a lot of focus on youth. Birmingham is our youngest city. I think the median age in Birmingham is about 36, about 4 years below the national average. Different parts of Birmingham are younger. So the story that was so powerfully told about London having a vision for the future, it's a very natural way for Birmingham to tell its story about the world. One of the themes we had about the Commonwealth and making it relevant today when we were thinking about that a generation ago was the Commonwealth in the classroom. And I think we've worked out that, a quarter of children across Britain probably have a cousin in a Commonwealth classroom. It'd be a lot higher than that in Birmingham. And so the story of the classrooms of Birmingham and their links across all the different parts of the Commonwealth is another powerful way to tell that story. And I also think it's useful for this sort of Britain's international presence, as with the Climate Change Summit, as with other aspects of sport, to just normalise the internationalism of Britain, hosting the Commonwealth Games, bidding for World Cups, taking part in European football championships and so on, having people-led things that in a way say Britain is internationalist. Britain is the country that is involved in sport, that is involved in culture, and again taking that beyond the frame of Brexit is quite helpful, I think, because Brexit is a choice we made in Britain by the margin of 52% to 48%. And if you actually look at British attitudes to other countries and other countries' attitudes to Britain, other countries' attitudes to Britain have not changed very much because of Brexit, and our attitudes about other countries have not changed very much. Our attitudes about America will depend on whether Donald Trump is the president, not about Brexit and so on, with the exception actually of European attitudes towards Britain have changed much more than other attitudes. I don't think it's made us more or less popular in India that we've done Brexit. I think Britain has relationships with India that we can work on and that we can extend, but I don't think they're thinking about our political choices in Europe. It has discombobulated attitudes in Europe. So the British think something very similar that we used to think about the Swedes and the Germans and the French. And in the attitudes data, those countries are thinking a little bit differently about Britain now. What was that about and what does it mean, and is it a choice against internationalism? And there I think it's very important just for Britain to be being internationalist, a democracy on the global stage, hosting the world, having those values in order to allay some of the concerns of countries in Europe. So I think Brexit could be a problem for sporting diplomacy in other contexts other than the Commonwealth, but it's also a problem we can get beyond. I mean, if we want to bid to World Cups, we will want to be the choice of UEFA, and UEFA is not the European Union. In fact, with Brexit, not a lot of people realise this, there are now 28 non-European members of UEFA and 27 EU members, because there are a lot of UEFA members in the United Kingdom, more than there are in lots of other countries. But you will need very good relationships with the EU members of UEFA and the non-EU members of UEFA if you want to bid for World Cup. So again, it's the normalisation of our internationalism and Brexit not affecting that, despite being a political domestic choice we've made, that will be as important, I think, to sporting diplomacy as telling a story about trade links in different areas. I think the other important thing about these events, why do these events matter? We can exaggerate, I think, their economic impact, and perhaps we exaggerate their impact even on sporting participation. They matter because they're things we do together. And in a more fragmented world, we're looking for things that we do together. There used to be lots of things when there were only 2 television channels that 15 or 20 million of us did. There are only now big sporting events and the odd royal occasion that bring 15, 20 million of us together. And so we value those events and occasions more. And I think the soft power story has often been about the story you want to tell to the world, that you want to project, that you want to change the image that people have in the world. I think you only project the image to the world if you get it right at home. And I think it's become more important now with these soft power arguments to actually show the ownership of the Commonwealth Games, the story about young Birmingham in a young Commonwealth with an optimism about the future, in order to project the kind of soft power messages you want to project about Britain. All of the points that have been made about delivery first are very, very important. People forget that we're very, very anxious about whether these events will work, before they happen, and they can go right or they can go wrong. I think London 2012 has really reminded us that when they can go well, they can go fantastically well, because in an increasingly fragmented society, I think we want the memories of the times when we come together, you know, whether it's as a city, as a country, and a part of the same thing. So I think Birmingham will do well with these games, despite all the delivery challenges, because there'll be even more of an appetite for events to happen. You know, post-COVID, even restricted events, when you see crowds, the sort of emotional, you know, the emotional unusualness of seeing the normal at the moment, a football crowd, people going clubbing, people going to a stadium. I think the Commonwealth Games will still be picking up on that. But I think it's good for Britain's internationalism, because it isn't about the politics of the choice we made on Brexit.
Marvellous, thank you very, very much, Cinder. That's good to put in the broader context, and it's great to have you back on an FBC panel in 20 years on. So I'm delighted to now bring in Chris for his reflections on the discussion today. And as I said, he's very kindly stepped in at the last moment on behalf of Alison McGovern, who's his shadow colleague, who was due to, with her sport hat, to be talking today. But Chris, is there anything sort of coming out?
Adam, thank you, and I'm pleased to do my best to step in for Alison. I've just got a few reflections on what I thought was some fantastic and different contributions, but all nevertheless stacked together well. I listened to this idea of it being a post-Brexit games. Daniel talked about the idea that this was to demonstrate that Britain was open for business, and I'll lay my cards on the table. I was, shall we say, a Brexit skeptic, would be a mild way of putting it, but that debate has moved on. But I can't help thinking that that suggestion of a post-Brexit Britain open for the world games was designed more for an internal UK audience rather than to demonstrate to the world that we are here. And I think Sunday might have been hinting at that just now, that actually that was more about trying to convince ourselves, or trying to convince parts of the UK that there was a benefit to Brexit, which frankly was going to be irrelevant anyway, in my view, and it's a little bit opportunistic. It was probably irrelevant before Brexit, and the world has moved on, and I suspect it's irrelevant now. And as other panelists have said, so many of the participants here will have been unaffected anyway by Brexit. But I'm just find myself a little bit skeptical that that is actually something that is designed to appeal to a UK audience rather than to a wider global audience, and to feed into this slogan of Global Britain, which has never really been explained in any real clarity. We've obviously meeting in the context of the pandemic, and again, I think Neil talked about this, and Tanny talked about this. But if we're looking ahead to what major events are coming up, we've got the European Football Championships coming up. They will be affected. We've got the Olympics in Tokyo. There's still a big question mark over those. There's the Winter Olympics coming up. Obviously, that they're in China, that brings with it its own difficulties and its own restrictions. So all things being equal, and if we are able to move out of this pandemic, this will be the first, as far as I can make out, major event globally post-pandemic that the world will be looking to, perhaps to put a smile back on the face of the world as well as the UK. There may well have still to be some restrictions in the way that we operate, in the way that visitors manage it. Visitors are managed as well as participants, and that will add extra difficulties to the organising group. But there is almost a responsibility on Birmingham to do its best to get us back on the road to normality, if I can say that, which adds to the additional challenge, and the additional challenge on top of the additional challenges of having to do everything so quickly. But it's also a positive as well, that we can be able to be showing the world that way forward. There's another aspect to this, and with the greatest respect to Neil, who has did a wonderful job in London and made his reputation there, as somebody from the north who always moans that London gets everything, it's nice to have somewhere in the UK hosting a major event that isn't London, and to be able to showcase other parts of the UK to a global audience. And I think that will be an important aspect of showcasing a wider Britain as well, which I hope we will be able to do. I'm concerned, I speak to some colleagues in Birmingham who still don't feel that the local community has entirely bought into this. There's a suggestion that it's being done to them, not with them, with the local community participating. They don't feel that they're getting the full benefit of the games. But I also reflect on something that Neil said, which I felt entirely as well. Again, having for London 2012, flipping heck, London gets everything. But actually, once it started, the sense of buzz that Neil referred to, the sense of excitement, seeing the guests, the ambassadors on the streets with their and the volunteers with their uniforms, walking down Whitehall and hearing the beach volleyball taking place in Horse Guards Parade, and a huge cheers going up, and there was a sense of buzz there. And I hope that but when Birmingham gets going and it brings in all those Brummies into to working within the scene, that it is able to capture that same sense of excitement, but also community excitement as well. But I would caution and urge the organisers to make sure that they work with the communities to make sure that everyone does feel involved. It's interesting. Neil talked about Neil referred to India and the reputational damage the Delhi Games, and I think, for example, of Qatar with the World Cup, where they've been dogged by allegations of poor labour standards and so on. And it's absolutely vital that Birmingham set the highest standards in terms of labour practices and construction practices, for example, employment practices, so that we can set an example to the world of the way that we treat them. That obviously goes for volunteers as well. It's very easy to damage a reputation such as that. And the other issue that has been impressed upon me by colleagues is the whole idea of sustainability. Was it Sundar that talked about this coming hot on the heels, really, of COP in Glasgow as a next big global event that the UK is hosting, where we can showcase the UK. My colleague Liam Byrne, when I was speaking to him about this morning, talked about Birmingham once being the workshop of the world, and now we can make it the green workshop of the world by bringing forward all the new technologies that will drive us forward in that green industrial revolution. It's a fantastic opportunity, to achieve that, but also in terms of a legacy of sustainability to drive forward, to embed those, doing what Birmingham is the best at, which is making things. Always has been and wants to reassert itself as well. So if we're talking about legacy, of course we're talking about sporting legacy, participation legacy, change in economics, socioeconomic and health indices by getting people involved, by investing in communities. But it's also important to you to embed that legacy of sustainability in everything that Birmingham is doing, and that we can then take out to the rest of the world. There was one other issue. No, I'll tell you what, Adam. I will leave it there. But I hope I've tried to reflect on some of the things that other colleagues have said. And thanks very much.
No, absolutely. Thank you very much, Chris. And as I said, thank you so much for coming in at the 11th hour when obviously, you know. Yeah, I think so. So that's really important to get your reflections on that. So we're going to be doing. So if people want to ask any questions, can you please put them in the Q&A box? That would be very helpful for us. I think there's a number of questions that I've got coming out of that, but I think we'll start with one of the things that that they're asking, you know, can we sort of define who the we is in terms of how it's crucial for hosting Birmingham next year, whether it's the world, the Commonwealth, strategic partners around within the Commonwealth, the UK, England, Birmingham, Midlands. Who is the we that was responsible for sort of delivering the identity of the games? Is there any sort of, you know, how is Birmingham, how is the Birmingham Games pitching itself, and how is the UK pitching who the games are representing to the world? I think that's yeah, the question that's being asked there. Is there anyone want to come in on that one in particular?
I mean, I think it's quite a complicated and it's quite an interesting question. And one of the things that struck me coming to the Birmingham Games is how complicated the governance around the games is, and actually much more complex in some ways than the governance around London 2012. And I suppose I don't know whether it's an issue that's been created by the combined authority and the city, and particularly the fact that the combined authority and the city have different political complexions and different political parties in their leadership. I suppose I've been struck a bit, I mean, this may be unfair, about the comparative lack of a really strong regional voice. At the top of championing the games and speaking for the games, and I just wonder, I mean, the games does actually span not just Birmingham. There's a lot of other parts of the West Midlands who are hosting big venues. There's a lot happening in Coventry. There's stuff happening in Wolverhampton. I just detect a bit of in some of the political discussions I've been on the fringes of, a bit of a sense of, well, we're not spending any more money in Birmingham. Where's the stuff for us? And one of the things that struck me, we did manage to do in London, was to avoid a lot of that, and particularly to avoid any cross-party issues in the running of the games. So I don't know. I mean, I'm not really answering the question. I suppose I am just flagging. I just feel, the issue around the region, the city's leadership is going to become more and more important. And it links in with the point that I think Chris was making about communities, and the real need to get that buy-in from communities. I think the volunteering program, some of the cultural events that are going, there's really quite an exciting cultural program, will make a difference to that. But I don't think it really comes alive until you get that buzz. I mean, in London, it didn't really come alive until the torch relay started and we got into the month before the games. I think it will become exciting in the city. I think one of the things that the people are trying to do is to have some very prominent sites for everyone in the heart of the city, in the Smithfield area, something that was very successful in Glasgow. So I hope that will come, but I just think it's really important. And I don't know. I do think it comes down a bit to who's the political lead for the region here? Is it the leader of Birmingham Council? Is it the mayor of the West Midlands? I think they really need to work together, those two, and in a way that maybe they haven't always found easy.
Thanks so much. Did Cinder want to come in then, Danny?
Yeah, sure. I think there is this, potential Birmingham and West Midlands tension. Birmingham is the host city, but it belongs more broadly. The host nation, the team on the track, etc., is England, not Britain. And people forget that sometimes until the Commonwealth Games starts, that you've got England and Scotland and Wales there, and that's quite interesting as well. Obviously, in the Olympics, it's Team GB, and Team GB has become another great, shared symbol of Britishness. But the Commonwealth Games being England is actually quite interesting, I think, because it shows us that the diversity of Birmingham and Birmingham's Commonwealth roots make it a British city and an English city, and that all of the diversity of Britain that we associate with Team GB is also in the English team that we field at the Commonwealth Games. And this is important actually for the identity of Englishness, which has become more polarizing potentially, which has an inclusive identity during major football tournaments, because the England we see on the field at the European Championships is representing London and Barnsley and everywhere in between. But it's useful, I think, to see that Birmingham has its Commonwealth diversity and is hosting the England team, because I think Englishness is going on the same journey as British identity, but it hasn't had the same cultural, political and civic leadership that British, Scottish and some extent Welsh identity have all had.
Thank you. Brilliant. Danny.
Yeah, just to, I suppose, echo Neil and Sunder's points, I can see it teaching at Aston. I haven't kind of spoke about the Commonwealth Games with students over the last 3 years. The students who've always got the biggest problem are the students who live in Wolverhampton, because they perceive it, oh, it's Birmingham getting it and Wolverhampton's missing out. You know, the fact that it's the region's known as the West Midlands and it will never be known as Greater Birmingham is instructive. You know, if Liverpool had got the Commonwealth Games, it would be a very different games. I think, you know, Merseyside is a much more cohesive region than the West Midlands is, certainly. I think the other points about that's something made about kind of the UK context and often sport being a disintegrative force rather than an integrative force in terms of the territorial politics of the UK is also important. And I noticed there's probably a question we'll come on to later about the rhetoric around global Britain harks back to those notions of kind of 19th century notions of Greater Britain. And that is so Anglo-centric. I think that is another potential kind of fly in the ointment.
Brilliant, thank you. Chris.
Yeah, I mean, Danny's just said something similar to me. I mean, I think it's not quite answering the question, but we will be whoever wants to capitalize on a particular success at a particular time. I recall Alex Salmond waving the saltire in Wimbledon from the Royal Box when Andy Murray had just had a victory, and there will be a lot of people out there who will be wanting to claim success that will suit them at the particular time. And Daniel made this point, but this was the point I meant to refer to earlier, and I forgot a bit at the start of the discussion about these being separate teams. And of course, between now and then, the domestic politics of the UK may have chopped and changed a little bit depending on what's happening in some of the nations, and that may well be exploited as well. So there is a hope. You know, I'd like to think that there is a real opportunity for bringing the UK together. But I think, as has already been suggested, there's also plenty of people out there who will be quite happy to use whatever success they see to push their own particular agendas.
Lovely, thanks, Chris. So in the chat, we've got a sort of 3 interrelated questions, really, which I think are at the meat of what us as the Foreign Policy Centre are interested in this debate, is around that link between the Games and the post-integrated review concept of global Britain and Britain's place in the world, and basically how the Games is part of the UK soft power arsenal. And obviously we've talked about that a bit so far today. We've also talked about some of the things that root it on the ground in communities in the West Midlands and in the world of sport. But it's the diplomacy and soft power side that are of particular importance to us as the FPC. So we've got a question from Gavin Price about how the global Britain agenda is perceived in those other parts of the UK, in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. In that particular context, as Sunda said, obviously that we're competing as England at the Games. So basically, so Gavin's point is particularly about what can be learnt from the other home nations in terms of their approach to sport diplomacy and the use of sport to place themselves on the world stage as constituent nations. And yeah, obviously, and talking about what was learned from 2012 in terms of, I suppose, when Neil was going out into to promote the Games and the idea of the Games, one of the key things was obviously it presented a vision of Britain as set out in the opening ceremony that gave a very particular view of British identity at the time. And I'd be interested to know how people see that, as you know, how that vision has changed over time, whether that's had the longevity in terms of the UK's global perceptions. So perhaps we can address those questions from Gavin Basic about the Scottish, Welsh and Northern Irish response. Had also there's what can be learnt from that conceptual point in London. Is there anything that anyone wants to come in on that?
I could chip
thanks.
in with something. I think the questions of how, I think broadly there'd be scepticism of a global Britain agenda or support based on your party politics and your position on the big issues like Brexit. So it's going to play well with Scottish Conservative Unionists in Scotland and Welsh Conservatives or pro-Brexit people in Wales. But it's on the whole it's politicising something that is broader before it's politicised, and I think its international value is greater when you leave the politics out than when you put the politics in. Just want to flip the question about the national, say the Welsh use of sporting diplomacy and so on. The case of Scotland is very interesting, I think, because I would say Scotland is considerably less dependent now on sport for its status at home and its status in the world than it used to be. And there was a time when Scotland had a very, very good football team once upon a time when it qualified for all the World Cups, never quite got through to the knockout stages for reasons of bad luck, even though they would score very great goals, such as Archie Gemmill's goals. But there was then the phrase which was that Scotland was a 90-minute nation. And this was around 1978 when it didn't quite vote for devolution, or it did vote for devolution, it didn't get it. And they were meant to win the 1978 World Cup, and they came home without it. And then they didn't get devolution, and that was a real nadir for modern Scottish identity. If you look at Scottish sport now, they qualified for this European Championships. They'll be back at Wembley as they were in Euro '96, but it just matters much less whether they qualify or they don't qualify for European Championships and World Cups, because Scotland has a cultural status, a number of institutions, a parliament, a cultural status, and so it's less dependent on this incredibly capricious thing of did you qualify, did you qualify, have you got a great tennis player, etc. Now, I'm not saying that sport can't put people on the map. I'm sure it's brilliant for Wales that the presence of the football team, the presence of the rugby team. If the big Welsh teams are in the Premiership, that will be really helpful for those places. But actually, sport is incredibly powerful as a symbol of your nation in terms of the people who make up your nation, representing the diversity of your nation. But actually, as a message into the world, if you're too reliant on sport, you should find something a bit less capricious and a bit less fickle, I think, to bet your chips on.
Definitely, but I suppose the question is how much of the games is about the sport, and also the what, and obviously we remember many great things about London 2012 in terms of what happened on the track and in the pool and everything else. But in terms of, as I said, it was for me, certainly in terms of the how Britain presented itself was through through the opening and closing ceremonies in terms of that particular vision. And I'm interested to know to what extent the wider work around Birmingham will be attempting to do the same thing, and whether that will be a message about Birmingham and the area, or whether that'll be a broader message for the country.
Well, can it be both, Adam?
Yeah.
There's no reason why it can't be both. And I have to say, as I said earlier, I have this skepticism about this whole notion of global Britain, which I think is a convenient excuse, if you like, to justify a particular policy, in this case Brexit, on the basis that we'll leave the European Union, but everything will be fine because instead we'll trade with the world. And it's being shoehorned into something that perhaps in this respect is not appropriate, because it's a large sporting event, maybe with a little bit of cultural diplomacy thrown in. But I don't see any reason why this can't put Birmingham on the stage and the UK on the stage. As I say, I'm saying the UK rather than England, even though one of my colleagues has just said it's England that is hosting, because that's the way I look at things. And if it's done right, then the benefit should flow both to Birmingham and with Wolverhampton and the rest of the West Midlands, but also to the rest of the country.
Lovely. No, thank you. Neil, did you want to come
in? I think it's quite interesting. I mean, there's a real sense, isn't there, in which the fact that the home nations all participate in their own right, and there is no Team GB, makes this a bit of a challenge for some of the ways in which the government might want to pitch and present the event, and for the understandably huge political focus that there is now on issues concerning the union. And it will be very interesting to see. I mean, it'll be fascinating to see what the opening ceremony is like, and how that plays. I mean, I think it's fairly common knowledge now, as a result of the London 2012 opening ceremony, that there was a lot of political attention placed on the content of that ceremony. And, you know, I think Danny Boyle's talked about how people were uncomfortable with some people were in politics were uncomfortable about the presentation of the NHS at the heart of that ceremony. And I certainly am more than well aware, having been involved in conversations around that, about quite how much political focus there was on the content of that ceremony, and actually having Stephen Daldry and Danny Boyle was a huge benefit to that ceremony, because it was very difficult to second guess people of that caliber and that standing. And I will be fascinated to see how that ceremony pans out. I haven't yet had any indication at all, but it's quite challenging. It seems to me it really is. And yeah, I mean, watch that space with interest. I think making the cultural program that's talked about a lot really successful and really reach into Birmingham communities is very important. I'm slightly on a different thread here. There has been quite a lot of political controversy around elements of the game's delivery and the extent to which they've been welcomed by communities who are affected by them. A lot of controversy about some of the changes to some of the transport to road systems and the impacts on the Perry Bar area in Birmingham. And I think there is always a huge challenge about when people's lives are being disrupted by construction programs and the like, trying to persuade them that the games are really doing something for them. So I've talked a lot about, I'm going a bit off thread here, but I'll carry on. I've talked a lot about how brilliant the Stratford regeneration legacy is. And I think now that if you go out and you talk to people in that part of East London, you will find a real recognition of that. And I think you have done that for some time. There's always been people who are willing to say it's been a gentrification and not a regeneration, but I don't think that is the perception of the great majority of people in that part of East London. I think there has been talk about a similar, I mean, I think East Manchester is another example where I think if you go to East Manchester now and talk to people about the legacy of the Manchester Commonwealth Games, they will also generally be very positive about that. And I think it's a real challenge for everyone to try and make sure that people feel the same in Perry Bar. And there's a long way to go before that's the case. I hope it will be the case, but it needs a lot of aspiration, and it needs more investment, and it needs to make people come out of that feeling that this really has changed that part of the city for its residents for the good. And we are quite a long way from that yet.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much, Daniel. Daniel.
Yeah, just to make a quick kind of related point, I think one thing that's also worth recognising is that the sporting organisations, federations are diplomatic actors in themselves with their own interests. And I think that can sometimes complement the wider kind of diplomatic aims, and sometimes it can frustrate. So one of the things in the blurb for this event was thinking ahead towards the 2030 World Cup bid, And I think the Commonwealth Games and how they are managed in terms of the territorial politics of the UK will be crucial for that bid, because if a lot of the rhetoric and talk around it alienates not just the relevant parts in terms of the kind of the political assemblies and governments of those constituent parts of the UK, but also the sporting federations, though particularly the football federations, then that will be a non-starter. It's also interesting that, going back to that idea of an appeal to the Anglosphere, that it's a UK and Ireland bid for the World Cup, and Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, is not part of the Anglosphere in the way it's usually conceived. So I think all these things are important for the game. Going back to that weak question, what is the way in terms of this projection of sports diplomacy over the next decade to kind of 20 years?
Brilliant. Thanks, Tony. So Verity Postlethwaite's come up with an interesting point in the questions about freedom of speech and the idea of protest. She says that Ian Reid and David Grimberg have publicly declared they'll be comfortable and flexible with the athletes and communities expressing themselves. What are the views of the panel speakers on the potential protest or freedom of expression by athletes or communities in and around the Games? And how would that link into the broader questions around the use of the Games for sport diplomacy and sort of broader presenting the Games to the world? Does anyone have a view on that one?
Two different kind of questions there, Adam. I think one would be about, say, political protest or domestic protest, or protest about the local disruption or the environmental protest, i.e. by local people about it. And the other is, I think, athletes themselves in the Games, using the Games to make political statements. I think we've heard the IOC is planning to be tough on that in a way that might be controversial. I don't know what the answer is about the Commonwealth Games. You have quite a soft brand, I think, in the Commonwealth. It might have a post-imperial, reason and origin story. It's basically it's a brand that represents diversity and youth, and has a sense of itself as a quite progressive brand. It tells itself the story of how it gathered together against apartheid. That's one of its kind of memories of what it has meant to be in the Commonwealth. And so I think the sort of Anglosphere Commonwealth and the multi-ethnic Commonwealth kind of converge quite well. So to get yourself into trouble on those sorts of issues would be a shame. But let's see what the governance of the sporting body is like.
No, thanks.
Yeah, just to come in, I've not seen the statements from the local organised committee in me, but I think the trials and tribulations that the IOC has got in shows I don't think you can kind of legislate and plan for these things, because if you say you're allowed to do this protest in this space, and it's not really a protest, is it? So I think it's always going to be post hoc. You can't plan for what you permit, and if you do, you just get yourself into a massive hornet's nest. So I think kind of a relatively flexible, pragmatic approach is probably the best way forward.
Absolutely. Anyone else want to come on that? No need to. If not, I've got something from Brett Ostler in Perth, who was so again on some similar themes to before, but asking what elements of the Games will we focus on sport diplomacy both in the UK and abroad, in the common. Specifically in the Commonwealth nations, and to what extent will there be a sort of economic, environmental, or social justice dimension to the way in which the Games are being promoted in those to a Commonwealth audience and a global audience?
I mean, I do think the issues around the sustainability stuff in the Games is something that the organisers are genuinely really committed to. I think they have set themselves a really quite challenging statement that it's going to be a carbon neutral Games, and I think people are going to have to work quite hard to live up to that. It's not clear to me how they're measuring that, and as soon as you start talking about carbon neutrality, you get into some quite complicated technical debates about embodied carbon and so on and so on. So there need to be some really sharp illustrations of what they mean by that. There's this big offsetting program that's being talked about, but obviously with the COP, with the focus on net zero, I think that is a potential win internationally if they can really broaden that out and demonstrate that it is breaking new ground in terms of events, big events and environmental standards. I think London 2012 did a good job on that. And it will certainly be important to make sure that you win endorsement for that approach from the NGOs who are concerned about environmental issues. So I think that's one area where there is real potential for the Games to both set new standards and have some broader impact.
Great, fantastic. Anyone else want to come in on those issues?
Just to say a similar follow-on point, just to say that I think Birmingham, partly because of the lack of planning time, may not be susceptible to the usual mega events syndrome, and the fact that there's not that many purpose-built venues, involved. It's generally upgrading existing venues. So I think that's in terms of both environmental sustainability, but also sustainability in terms of the long-term use and viability of those venues, that should help. So in some ways, the lack of time for delivery may be an unintended benefit in that sense, perhaps.
Brilliant. Okay, excellent. Anyone else want to come in on that? Or okay, in which case, I think so. More broadly, are there any sort of other sort of burning issues that people think they want to address before we close for this evening in the broader context? Hi, Cinder.
I just somebody, I think Daniel was talking about the 2030 bid, and I'm slightly confused about this as a focus for our sports diplomacy. I think it's incredibly impressive in the United Kingdom in its current state that you can have a joint bid across the nations and governments of the UK with the FAs, especially when you have separate teams, and it's especially impressive to have Dublin there as well. And I really welcome that, because I think the period from 1986 and the Good Friday Agreement through to Brexit was an incredibly powerful period of UK-Irish diplomacy, and it's somewhat at risk. That's really good, and it might be that the domestic benefits of showing you can bid for it are really important and really valuable. But it seems to be really unlikely that we're going to get it. And so I wonder if that's priced into the sports diplomacy thing. It is the centenary of the World Cup. And Argentina and Uruguay, who hosted it and played the final, of bid as well, and we didn't turn up. So it's the one cycle in which our sort of whole football's coming home, invented the world kind of thing is really offside. And I think the 104th anniversary. So it's just quite interesting as to whether the act of bidding and talking about how good it will be, and I'd love a World Cup, in post-COVID time to come here. Does it matter if you don't get it? Is it of benefit? Anyway, Chris, are you backing the bid for the World Cup?
Oh, absolutely. I was born after the only just after the last domestic World Cup. I was out of the country on for the European Championships in '96 for two of the best games. So it's about time we had something here. Yes, definitely.
I think it has I partly agree. I think it has the potential to be extremely. I was also involved in the last effort to get us the World Cup, which of course was a complete debacle. And actually, it's fairly remarkable. But I can say for certain that the team that was out there, which was the lead team, was David Cameron, Boris Johnson, and Prince William, and they were completely under a misleading impression as to what the chances of winning were, which were of course close to zero. And eventually we got the one vote from the one Brit who was allowed to vote. And I don't know, because I don't know what FIFA's like these days, and I've no idea how it plays. But you can. There was all the difference in the world between the way in which the London 2012 team, the pre-games team, led by Keith Mills in particular, ran the Olympic bid, and the way in which the last Brit effort to win the World Cup was led. And I hope we're going to do it a lot better. I can imagine that it's going to be, as Sundar hints, an extremely difficult one to win.
Thanks so much. Any final thoughts from anyone?
I just wonder. Sorry, I came in as a last minute substitute, and I'm chattering a lot more than I expected. I just wonder if we can overplay sometimes, without wanting to diminish the whole concept of the evening and the work that you're doing. I just wonder sometimes if we can overplay and overthink the impact on diplomacy using sport. And Neil touched on this, I think, earlier as well. The best way that we can advertise Birmingham and the best way that we can sell the UK is not by trying to attach slogans to one thing or another, but by having a really great sporting event and making people feel welcome and looked after when they come here. And if we get those right, then I wouldn't necessarily bother about slogans such as Global Britain. I just think proud that we've done it and that we've got a legacy that we can build on after the games have finished.
I think that's right. I think the government may well choose to do this because it is one of the tools in their diplomatic toolbox after the COP and everything else. But I think you're right. The way to do it is by showing rather than telling. It's embedding the message within whatever you're doing and having doing a really good show, putting on a really good show, rather than, and then you can do the stuff around the edges to make it to make those links, rather than beating you over the head with it as a diplomatic tool. Any last thoughts from anyone, and then we'll head off.
I'll just make the point I've already made again, that if you don't leave something positive behind in the parts of Birmingham where the games are focused, if you can't make Perry-Barr a better place, both for people who live there now and for the people who are going to come and live there in what was going to be the Commonwealth Games village, but which alas isn't going to be used by the athletes, but is still a huge and ambitious housing and regeneration project, I think that'll be an enormous shame. And I think people will talk about it for quite a long time afterwards, at least people in Birmingham will. So I really think there's got to be focus on that as well as putting on a great show.
Thanks. Brilliant. Excellent. Well, thank you so much, everyone. And thank you to those who've been watching on Facebook and those who joined us on Zoom. Thank you very much and have a lovely rest of the evening. Take care. Bye-bye.